were good. The ones that Moses gave, was that good? Yes. But what did Mary give us? Jesus. Is that better? Yes. See that? So here we have, in just this immediate vision of chapter 12, the ark of the Old and New Covenants. And this is again an interplay that we have seen since the beginning of the book of Revelation. This Old New Covenant coming together. God's bringing them together. All right? So, if you notice on your outline, I have, who is this woman? Who is this woman? And of course, immediately everyone says it's the Virgin Mary. And you're not wrong, and I've said that before. I believe that she is this, that is the immediate literal understanding. But understand also, it says very clearly, a great sign appeared. She represents something more. Something more. Okay. Yes. Yes. And that's what we're going to unpack. The symbolism of the sun, the moon, and the stars around this woman. Let's step back for a moment. When you hear sun, moon, and stars, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Creation. Yes, the creation account. You remember back in Genesis 1, on the fourth day, what did God create? The sun, the moon, and the stars. And we've been here before with this idea. What do the sun and the moon and the stars do? What are they being charged with by God to do?
Give light.
Give light and to... Yes, it tells us what time of year it is, what season it is. Okay? And if you don't believe me, you just have to read Genesis 1 for yourself. So, if you go to Genesis 1, God tells you why he made the sun, the moon, and the stars. Genesis 1:14. God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to separate day from night. Let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years. And let them be lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. Did you hear that? The sun and the moon have this governing ability. So there's that ruling and reigning again. And this time it's applied to this woman. So it gives added credence to her royal stature. Because the very cosmic forces that rule the day and the night are her clothing. She is wrapped in this. Do you see what I mean? Yes. Yes. Yes, that's correct. The greater light is the sun, the lesser light is the moon. And the stars also. And we went over this idea when we talked about, in Revelation where it says the sun will be darkened and the moon will turn to blood and the stars will fall from heaven, and how that is prophetic language to describe how a new age is dawning, how a new season is starting, how God is doing something new in the world. It's prophetic language. It's not necessarily to be taken literally. Could it have a literal meaning? It could, but that's not its primary purpose. It's to designate the separation of an old way from a new way. Yes? A comet is basically an astronomical body. It's basically a big ball of ice that, as it approaches the sun, begins to evaporate. And as a result, that's what causes the tail. So it's just basically a big ball of ice that can have a very dramatic effect when looked upon. In ancient times, comets were considered bad omens. They were considered evil omens. So, all of those things that happen in the sun, the moon, and the stars were considered high consequence in ancient times. And so it's not surprising that we see how God can use those as portents of how he is changing things on the earth. And this is why Peter said what he did on the day of Pentecost. To go back to our meditation of the glorious mysteries, Peter said, this is what was spoken of by the prophet Joel. That in the last days, God would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh. And if you read that in the 2nd chapter of Acts, I don't want to take too much time with this, but I want to get this idea of how the sun, the moon, and the stars have a significance in how God changes and moves in history. In Peter's sermon on verse 14 of chapter 2 of Acts, he says in verse 18, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. Okay? And they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heaven above and the signs on the earth beneath, blood, fire, vapor of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, the moon into blood, before the day of the Lord comes, the great and manifest day. And it shall be that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Those events of the sun and the moon and the stars didn't literally happen, at least not on a cosmic scale. But what did happen at the time of Pentecost was that a new covenant was starting. A new era had begun with the death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus into heaven, and the bringing of the Holy Spirit down upon the believers. That began a new era in God's timetable here on earth. That's what the prophet Joel was talking about in changing the sun, the moon, and the stars. So when we look at the lady that's clothed with this, we have to take that kind of, there's a reason why he chose that image to talk about what's clothing this woman. The second time that we see the sun, the moon, and the stars interacting, all right, is what I heard over here by Rebecca. The dream of Joseph. Not Saint Joseph, Mary's husband, but Joseph in the Old Testament. Turn to Genesis 37. Genesis 37. This gives us an identity as to what this woman is and does. You have to break apart the imagery. You have to understand its Old Testament reference.
37.
Okay? Now, many of you may have already known this story, but if not, here it is. You remember the story of Israel and his 12 sons. Okay? He had another son named Joseph, whom he loved very much. He loved him so much, he gave him a coat of many colors, it says. Okay? So let's read what it says. Jacob dwelt in the land of his father, sojourning in the land of Canaan. This is the history of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock of his brothers. He was a lad with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought an ill report to them to their father. Okay? His brothers saw that, in verse 4, but his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his other brothers. They hated him, and they could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they only hated him the more. He said to them, "Hear this dream which I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed low to my sheaf." So he's talking about gathering up wheat, and his wheat, their wheat, bowed down to his wheat. Okay, keep reading. His brothers said, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him yet more because of his dreams. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers. "Behold, I have another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the stars, 11 stars, were bowing down to me." Did you hear that? But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in his mind. Did you hear that? So Jacob had the wherewithal. He may not have liked it, but he knew something was cooking. All right? Now his brothers could see through it too, but they didn't care. They eventually threw him in a cistern, a well, then took him out, sold him to the Ishmaelites, who sold him to Egypt. And then they told his father Jacob that a wild animal had killed him. And they showed him his famous coat, all tattered and smeared with goat's blood. And Jacob just wept and was very mournful for losing Joseph. He thought he had died. The point is, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing to Joseph. Okay? That gives us an indication as to what is or who is the identity of this woman. Beyond being the Virgin Mary herself, I would say that these images of the Old Testament, of the sun, the moon, and the stars, have to do with Israel. This is Israel. This is the embodiment of the glory of Israel. Because if you read through the prophets always referred to Israel in two ways. They call her daughter Zion. You see that phrase a lot in the prophets. They also refer to Israel as a harlot, an adulteress, who has whored herself out to the nations, but in the way that God intended Israel to be was this glory, daughter Zion. It's unfortunate they never lived up to it. So that's why the prophets would call them out on it. What's wrong with you people? You need to be a holy bride to God, and yet you prostitute yourself out to the nations. Get it? You are meant to be a glorious queen, daughter Zion, a princess. And what you're doing is completely the opposite. That's what the message of the prophets are, or is. All right? So when I see this vision of the woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and the crown of stars, I think of this. One interpretation of it is that it is Israel, the glory of Israel. All right.